The Foolish Brother and His Wonderful Deeds. In Poland, many, many years ago, there once lived a poor peasant who had 3 sons. 2 of the boys were clever enough to earn a living, but the third had no interest at all in working long, hard hours in the field, nor did he show any inclination to learn a trade. Instead, he seemed quite content to spend his time crouched by the hearth or warming his hands over the stove. His parents were disappointed in their lazy son, but because he was kind and gentle, they forgave him and treated him as a fool. One day the king celebrated his name day and invited everyone in his kingdom, rich and poor alike, to his castle. When the 2 older brothers were dressed in their best clothes and ready to set out for the palace, the youngest son also wanted to go along, but his mother forbade him to go. "Dear child," she said, "your brothers will go to the palace and mingle with the crowd. They will tell clever stories and they will laugh at other people's jokes. But what can you do? You know no stories. You hardly ever laugh. When a girl looks at you, you run the other way. No, dear child, you would make a fool of yourself." "Very well, mother," the lad replied. "If that is how you feel, I will not go to the palace today. But I will go sometime in the future, and no one will even know that I have gone." The poor mother shook her head. She had no idea what her son meant. She ascribed his muttering to the feeble-mindedness that she thought he had. A few weeks after the party, the king posted a strange proclamation on the palace gates. It read as follows: "My daughter, the princess, is now living in the second-story apartment of the tower that has no door. Whoever is bold enough and strong enough to reach her shall marry her and become heir to the throne." Well, nearly every eligible bachelor in the kingdom hastened to the tower, but no one managed to scale the wall. One day, the 2 brothers thought that they would try also. Hastily, they made ready and were on their way. "I'm glad, my boy," said the mother to the youngest son, "but you know better than to attempt such a feat. Please go to the well and bring me a bucket of water." The lad picked up the bucket and pretended to go to the well. Instead, he walked to a wild rose bush that grew near the edge of the forest. He picked up a stick and struck the bush 3 times. Instantly, a fairy appeared. Her head was crowned with hair of the purest gold, and her silk dress embroidered with spidery webs of silver thread. "What do you wish?" she asked. "I need a fleet horse, garments of silver, and a purse full of silver coins." After he had received these items, he galloped away so rapidly that within minutes he overtook his 2 brothers, who were trudging along the road. "Where are you going?" he asked them. "To the palace," they replied, not realizing that the splendid knight was none other than their youngest brother. "Well, good luck be with you, then," he shouted, and he threw 3 silver coins to each of them. When he arrived at the king's palace, all of the great lords who were assembled there stared at him in astonishment and great admiration. Never before had they seen anyone clad in such magnificent garments. The lad then looked at the tower and dismounted. With one mighty leap, he almost attained the window where the princess sat and gazed at him with great love. But, having failed, he neither looked forward nor backward. Instead, without saying a word, he remounted his horse and trudged away. When he arrived back at the rosebush, he struck it thrice. The good fairy appeared and hid the horse as well as the fancy garments. Then he dressed up in his old shabby clothes once again, filled up the bucket, and filled it. He picked up the bucket and filled it with water and walked home. A few hours later, the 2 brothers returned home. Excitedly, they told their mother of the fine prince and the silver steed who had given each of them 3 silver coins. "I wonder who he could be," the brothers said over and over again, while their youngest brother sat next to the hearth, in complete silence. The next day, the 2 brothers set out for the castle again, and shortly after their departure, the lad who had stayed behind picked up the bucket to fetch some water. But just as he had done the day before, he immediately went to the bush and struck it 3 times. When the fairy appeared, he asked her for an even mightier horse, golden garments, and a sack full of gold coins. Off he went as fast as a whirlwind, if not faster, and in a few seconds he overtook his brothers. Without saying a word, he hardly slowed down, threw 10 gold ducats to each of them. He rode directly to the tower, right through the crowd that had gathered before it. With a single mighty leap, he attained the second story of the tower. He kissed the princess, but before she could speak to him, he jumped back down. He remounted his horse and rode away as swiftly as horse and rider were nothing more than a blurred shape. Arriving at the bush, he asked the fairy to hide the horse in fine clothes. Then he returned home, and was his custom, and squatted behind the stove. Late that afternoon, the two brothers returned, shaking with excitement. They told their mother what had taken place. The king was so furious that the prince had escaped that he offered a vast sum of money to anyone who will capture him. We have twice met him, and both times he has been good to us. If we meet him tomorrow, we will try to capture him. How do you plan to do that? Asked the youngest brother in the back of the stove. Clearly it seems to me that he knows a trick or two. You're just a fool, replied the oldest. Don't you worry about how we'll do it. Well, then, I wish you luck, replied the lad, for it seems to me that you'll need it. Very early the next morning, the two brothers left for the palace. To the mother's amazement, the lad was also up, puttering around the kitchen. I've never seen you get up this early, she said. With all the noise my brothers made, I couldn't sleep. I think I'll go into the forest and gather some firewood. But instead of finishing this chore, he rushed back to the bush and struck it 3 times. I would like a horse with the harness made of diamonds, garments made of rubies and emeralds, and a sachet full of jewels, he said to the fairy when she asked him what he wished. He jumped onto the horse's back and rode away so swiftly that within seconds he approached his two brothers. But instead of passing them by as he had done the day before, he slowed his horse down. There you are, you scoundrel, they shouted. In the name of the king, we'll have to take you in. But when they attempted to pull him off his horse, he gave each such a sound thrashing that soon both were lying on the ground, moaning and groaning and holding their heads. You're nothing but fools to think you can even capture me, he shouted in anger. But unlike you, he continued in a softer tone of voice, I feel sorry for fools. He pulled a handful of diamonds from his satchel and threw them on the ground. Take that for your trouble, he continued, while riding off at fantastic speed. When he reached the king's city, the guards and noblemen tried to seize him, but they fared no better than his two brothers. He was much too fast and much too agile. With the greatest ease he leaped to the second floor of the tower, and in plain sight of all assembled nobles below, he kissed the beautiful princess. Good prince, she said, I don't know why you will not stay with me, but take this ring as eternal proof that it is you, and only you, to whom I will marry. He took the gold ring and put it on his middle finger. It fit so perfectly that he knew he would never be able to take it off. Below the tower, the king's guards had gathered, hoping to capture him as soon as he descended. The lad looked down and laughed. Then he shouted, My friends, make no attempt to capture me, for even if you were as strong as oxen and had the wits of great wizards, you could never succeed. He jumped from the tower directly onto the back of his valiant horse, and a dazzling gallop, horse and rider, disappeared from sight. A few minutes later, he was back to the magic bush, returning to the fairy everything he had borrowed. Then, after having gathered some wood, he walked into the house and seated himself at his usual place behind the stove, and awaited the arrival of his brothers. Our fool of a brother was right, the oldest proclaimed, as soon as he entered. The prince cannot be captured. When we attempted to seize him, he gave us a sound beating. But then, instead of being angry with us, he threw us a handful of the most precious and beautiful diamonds that we've ever seen. When the old mother saw the valuable stones, she was very pleased and happy, for she knew that they would provide enough money for the rest of their lives. You must never go to the palace again, she said to her sons. And the brothers agreed, and never again, they added, would they try to seize the strange prince who had been so kind to them. In the meantime, the king was very upset that his daughter's suitor had disappeared. He decreed that all the noblemen of his realm must come to the palace that the princess might identify the heroic prince. Thus a feast was held, which lasted for 4 days and 4 nights. Each day different princes arrived, but the mysterious stranger never showed up. Then the king realized that he had erred in thinking that his prospective son-in-law was a nobleman of his kingdom. Therefore he commanded that a feast for beggars and poor country folk be held. "Everyone is invited," stated the proclamation, "no matter he be blind or lame." This feast lasted for 7 days, but the stranger did not appear. The king then sent messengers from house to house with specific orders to bring back to the palace the man that wore the princess's ring. He made it clear that he did not care who it was. Nearly a month had passed since this order had been given, and when the king's servants arrived at the house of the three brothers, when they saw the youngest brother sitting behind the stove in his dirty clothes, they asked him who he was and what he was doing there. "What difference does it make to you?" replied the lad. "Forgive him his bad manners," objected his mother. "He is my youngest son, and he is something of a fool." "No matter," replied the king's man. "We have orders to examine everybody." At last the lad came out from behind the stove. Indescribable was their astonishment when they saw that he wore the princess's ring. "So you are the mysterious knight," said the guards, shaking their heads in disbelief. "Come with us." The lad was brought before the king, still wearing his dirty shirt and tattered and torn cloak. The lord was hard-pressed indeed to believe that this was the same man who had performed such heroic deeds. But, as everyone soon realized, clothes can create their own impressions. For when the lad reappeared a few hours later, in a more becoming costume, he looked more dashing and handsome than any of the nobles in the king's realm. The king ordered that the wedding be held immediately, and the beautiful princess and the young man were married amidst great pomp and splendor. The happiness was short-lived, however, as a war broke out soon after the wedding. The king ordered that his two sons and his son-in-law prepare for battle. The son-in-law set out first. After having ridden for some time, he came upon a lovely pond. He dismounted from his horse and amused himself by catching frogs. When the king's sons arrived with the army, they were horrified to see their brother-in-law playing as a child. Completely disgusted, they took leave and continued their way to the field of battle. But no sooner had his brothers-in-law and the army disappeared than he mounted his horse and rode to the magic bush. After striking it 3 times, the good fairy appeared. "This time I ask for a magnificent stallion and a sword which I can defeat an entire army," he said. Dressed in an armored suit of strong, shiny blue-gray steel, and riding a horse that seemed to fly, he soon overtook his brothers-in-law who were leading the army. "Where are you off to?" he asked his brothers-in-law, who did not recognize him. "To war," they replied. "So am I," he replied. "Let us go together." When they reached the field where the enemy was encamped, he attacked so vigorously that he appeared to defeat the army single-handedly. Then he returned his horse about, and before anyone could say anything, he disappeared, dirt and dust a cloud enveloping him. When the king's sons returned to the palace, they told their father not only of the amazing victory, but also of their brother-in-law playing with the frogs. "And where is my son-in-law now?" the king inquired, livid with anger. "Here," replied the lad, who had just returned to the throne room. "Your behavior has brought shame on my kingdom," the king said sadly. Then he turned to his daughter and reproached her for having married a man who so clearly was a coward. "Things are as they must be," replied his daughter. "We shall see," said the king. The next day the king's sons did not go to battle. Instead, the king went himself, and he took his son-in-law with him. But before they had ridden a mile, the lad turned his horse around and rode in the opposite direction. "Coward!" shouted the king. "Never again will you enter my palace." When the king arrived at the field of battle, to his great surprise, he found the enemies already badly mauled and defeated. The enemy king, his head bowed, offered his sword in surrender. "What happened?" asked the king. "Your knight has the strength of 100 giants. He cut us to pieces single-handedly." "Where is he?" asked the king. "I must thank him and honor him." "He rests beneath that tree, for a wound was inflicted on him." The king visited the young hero, but did not recognize him as his son-in-law, for a visor was drawn down over his face. Blood gushed from a wound on his leg. The king took out a handkerchief embroidered with the crest of the realm and bandaged the knight's leg. "Who are you, my noble friend?" the king asked gently. "I am who I am," replied his son-in-law. "Well, even if you do not care to tell me, come to my palace and stay with me. You shall find welcome there for the rest of your life." "Perhaps I will do that," replied the young warrior. Then he mounted his horse and rode away. When he arrived at the palace, he lay down on his bed, for the wound on his leg was giving him considerable pain. Upon the king's return, his sons asked whether their brother-in-law had fought in the battle. "No," replied the king sadly. "He was not there. He is a coward. But a most noble knight cut the enemy army to pieces before I arrived. He was injured in battle, and I have invited him to stay at our palace." "Pray tell, father," asked the princess, who had overheard the conversation. "Did you, by any chance, bandage the hero's leg with your handkerchief?" "He has arrived, then!" exclaimed the king happily. "Take me to him at once." With great pride, the princess led her father to her husband's chamber. The king was speechless when he recognized the great hero, who was his own son-in-law. The lassie said, "What? Why did you not tell me it was you? Why did you want me to think of you as a coward?" "I did not want you to think of me as a coward, nor as a great warrior, nor as a fool. There is no virtue in vanity. It is as I told you in the field of battle. I am who I am, nothing more and nothing less. I do what I must do. I can do no more and no less." The king mulled over the strange answer for a long time, and if he learned anything from it, it was simply this: one should never be judged by the surface appearance alone, but by his real and deeper worth.